Hello everyone, welcome back to Inspired Ed. Today's psychology and its approaches. Let's start with the main question. How has contemporary psychology focused on cognition, biology, experience, culture, gender, and human flourishing? Let's start off with cognitive psychology, which is a field within contemporary psychology which explores how we perceive, process, and remember information, and also how we communicate and solve problems. So the cognitive revolution started all the way back in the 1960s, which led back to the early interest in the mind, and now it stays as the current definition as the science of behavior and mental processes. So our growing understanding of biology has led to psychology's most enduring debate, which is the issue of nature versus nurture, and whether or not the factor of genes or experience weigh more on our mental and behavioral processes. So Charles Darwin views natural selection as a way to shape behavior as well as bodies, leading to an evolutionary psychology study of our similarities because of our common biology as well as our evolutionary history. And behavior genetics focuses on the relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. So, leading to another branch of contemporary psychology is evolutionary psychology, as I mentioned earlier, as well as behavior genetics. So again, as I mentioned just now, the biggest issue in psychology today has always been the issue of nature versus nurture, which is the controversy over the relative contributions that genes and experience make to the development of one's psychological traits and one's behavior. So, going back in time, Socrates and Plato said that people's character and intelligence quotient and their certain ideas are inborn and innate, while Aristotle said that there is nothing in the mind that does not come from the external world, meaning he believes in experience over genes. And then going forward a bit in 1600s, John Locke disagrees with the idea of inborn ideas and said that the mind is a blank slate on which experience writes. And now we fast forward a little more to 1831, when Charles Darwin proposed the idea of natural selection, which is the principle that inherited traits better enable a organism to survive and reproduce in a particular environment, which will eventually survive and pass on successful genes for the future generation. And so let's move on to cross-cultural and gender psychology. So let's start with the definition of culture. Culture is the enduring behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values, and traditions shared by a group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next. However, our shared biological heritage as humans, as Homo sapiens, unites us universally. So, for example, people with dyslexia will all exhibit the same brain malfunction, no matter their race or their tradition or their culture or where they came from. And then another branch of contemporary psychology is positive psychology, which is the study of human flourishing with the goals of discovering and promoting strength that lets individuals and communities thrive. So it is mainly focused on understanding and treating troubles and developing a good life. Let's move on to the biopsychosocial approach, which is a key element in the AP psychology course and psychology's many theoretical perspectives. So the biopsychosocial approach incorporates three viewpoints to offer a complete picture of a certain behavior or action or mental process. These three factors are the biological influences, the psychological influences, and the social cultural influences. Specifically, biological influences can mean genetic predispositions to certain mental disorders or genetic mutations, natural selection, and genes responding to the environment. Psychological influences are more on the learned behaviors and learned expectations, and also the emotional responses and the cognitive processing and perceptual interpretation. Social cultural influence is mainly in regards to the presence of others, the cultural, societal, and family expectations, and influences from your peers and other groups, and also social media, like the media you consume, the TV shows you watch, and how they link back to your behavior and your mental process. Now on to the theoretical perspectives. So let's start with the behavioral perspective. The behavioral perspective mainly focuses on how we learn observable behaviors, observable responses. So, for example, someone working from the behavioral perspective might attempt to determine what triggers angry responses or aggressive acts. So these questions might include, how do we learn to fear certain objects, such as the fear of spiders, or certain situations like having social anxiety and fearing crowded places? And what is the most effective way to alter our behavior towards a certain goal, such as losing weight? The second perspective is the biological perspective, which is how the body and brain enable emotions, memories, and sensory experiences, and also how our genes and our environment influence our individual differences. So someone working from the biological perspective might study brain circuits that cause us to be red in the face, or how heredity and experience influence our individual differences in our mood and temperament. So sample questions might include, how do pain messages travel from the hand to the brain? How is blood chemistry linked with moods and motives? Or to what extent are psychological traits such as intelligence, personality, sexual orientation, and vulnerability to depression products of our genes and our environment? The third perspective is the cognitive perspective, which is how we encode, process, and store and retrieve information. So it might be studying how our interpretation of a situation affects our anger, and how our anger affects our thinking. So this could include questions like, how do we use information in remembering, reasoning, solving problems? And the fourth perspective is the evolutionary perspective, which is how the natural selection of traits has promoted the survival of genes. So this links back to Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection, and how there is a survival of the fittest, where only the strongest and remaining organisms can thrive and reproduce. So questions can include, how does evolution influence our behavioral tendencies? So someone working from the evolutionary perspective might analyze how anger facilitates the survival of our ancestors' genes. And how can we overcome barriers to our personal growth? How can we, yes. And the fifth perspective is the humanistic perspective, which is how we achieve personal growth and personal self-fulfillment. This emphasizes on human flourishing. So someone working from the humanistic perspective might be interested in understanding how angry feelings affect a person's potential for growth. As we will see, modern-day positive psychology incorporates humanistic psychology's emphasis on human flourishing. So sample questions might include how can we work toward fulfilling our potential, and how can we overcome barriers to our personal growth. And the second last perspective is the psychodynamic perspective, which is how behavior springs from unconscious drives and conflicts. Now, this perspective derives off of psychoanalytic theory, which is promoted by Sigmund Freud. And psychodynamic theory is a descendant of the psychoanalytic theory, and it focuses less on the sexual drives, but more on the unconscious drives from childhood and unresolved conflicts. So someone working from the psychodynamic perspective might view an outburst or a temper tantrum from a child as an outlet for unconscious hostility. And sample questions might include how can someone's personality traits and disorders be due to the person's unfulfilled wishes and childhood trauma. The last perspective is social cultural perspective, how behavior and thinking vary across situations and cultures. So someone working from the social cultural perspective might explore how expressions of anger vary across cultural contexts. And questions might include how are we affected by the people around us and by the culture we surround ourselves with. So, for example, in an Asian household, you might have a very strong value of working hard to achieve success, and that will compel you to work hard in school and to instill that value within yourself due to your surrounding culture. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again next video.